Cuphead was released in 2017 and immediately drew attention for its rubber hose art style derivative of cartoons from the early 1900s. It didn't take long for Cuphead to prove itself in more ways than just that. This was considered by many to be one of the best games of 2017, a year that had a lot of competition already. Breath of the Wild, Horizon Zero Dawn, Nier Automata, and many more came out that year, and this debut indie title stood beside or above many of them. Cuphead does not sacrifice gameplay for visuals. There is a very well-designed game underneath all of this, but over 3 years later, and I'm still in awe of the artistic talent that went into it that I can't help but gush for a bit. I was drawn to Cuphead for the same reasons as everyone else. I was captivated by its classy expressivity and jazzy soundtrack that bounces along in the background during every fight. If you've never seen much of this game before, I'd be interested to know what your initial reaction is to the clips I've played in this video so far. I hope that just watching and listening to these bits is enough to entice you to play it. Cuphead is by no means a masterpiece, but the work that Studio MDHR put into this game deserves to be recognized. If my short intro was enough to convince you to play it, then I encourage you to go do that and come back here after. Like most games, I think it can only be fully appreciated by experiencing it yourself. First, let me acknowledge that it may seem odd making a video on this game when there's DLC coming out for it in the near-ish future. I'll be honest, the main reason I wanted to do a video on Cuphead is because it's a game of small enough scale that I can tackle it. Beyond that though, the Delicious Last Course strikes me as something that will be distinct enough to deserve its own analysis. Going off of what the base game does, I imagine it will be largely based around the movement options of the new Chalice character. And that's the other reason why I'm here. I wanted to revisit this game in preparation for the DLC. I played Cuphead soon after it came out, and returning to it now with a more critical eye has made me appreciate it further while also becoming privier to its flaws. Let's get the most obvious praise out of the way first. The reason Cuphead looks as good as it does is because of the tireless work that Studio MDHR put in to hand draw and ink every single frame of animation in this game. According to the Guinness World Records, this game has over 45,000 frames of animation. 45,000! It's equally incredible as it is insane. Just the thought of drawing that many frames with this level of detail makes me dizzy. MDHR must have been crazy to aim for such a feat for their first game, and even more impressive than that, there are 0 points where that quality drops. Every character, environment, and boss feel like they had the same level of effort put into them, and I have to give kudos for that. Cuphead is the most damning piece of evidence I've ever seen that artistic talent can turn a mechanically average game into a brilliant one. And their hard work paid off because Cuphead leverages its art style to create a good gameplay experience. Cuphead is a run and gun, or at least it's presented like one, that has gained a reputation for being brutally difficult. Instead of its levels being platforming based, it's more akin to a boss rush against foes that launch flurries of attacks at you in relatively small arenas. It's so visually stimulating that if you're just watching footage with no prior knowledge on the game, it probably looks too graphically intense. Really, the opposite is true. The detail in the art allows bosses to have unquestionably clear telegraphs, which is perhaps the most important thing about all of them. If you've seen an attack once, you'll recognize it again and be prepared for it. This is how the game cleverly directs your focus between you and the boss at the right times to create a sort of flow to each fight. Your eyes train back and forth. You watch the boss to get the telegraph, recognize it, and then watch your character to dodge what's coming. Attacks generally stand out enough that you can see them coming from your peripherals at that point, without taking your attention off Cuphead or Mugman. On the surface, this turns Cuphead into a game that's 80% dodging and 20% shooting. I've come to a clearer realization of what this game is really about, though. Playing Cuphead again made me realize how similar all of these bosses are and how it eventually starts to work against the game. Hold that thought because we need to establish why bosses are designed this way. Cuphead's movement is very simple. You can move left, right, and jump. While in the air, you can press jump again to block pink attacks. You have a dash as a quick dodging maneuver, but you always dash a set distance. You can't cancel it partway through. You can lock in place to shoot diagonally, or duck, but both require you to stop, which is seldom helpful. This is critical because everything is built around those basic options. Nearly every attack in this game is slow-moving. It's not a game about quick reflexes or dodging on the fly, even though it looks like one until you pause for a second to think about it. And I think this is where a lot of frustration with the game comes from. Players play more reactively than proactively. Most levels in Cuphead punish that approach. Going back to what I said earlier about battle flow, attacks are slow enough that by the time they're finished, you can reposition yourself to prepare for the next attack. Even telegraphs are usually long enough themselves that you have time to change your positioning. This is important because it means that periods between attacks are not periods of rest. They still require your active attention because failing to focus will result in getting hit by the next attack. This is the most defining element of the game's boss design. Every boss in Cuphead is, to some degree, about multitasking. You could probably say the same thing about every video game ever, but Cuphead is much more straining on your focus. To be more specific, it's about micromanaging multiple things that demand your equal attention in intense bursts of combat. And that's what I think this game is really about. It's not about dodging attack after attack with swift reaction times because dodging attacks on their own is easy. Instead, it's testing your ability to handle an overwhelming number of little things at once and seeing if your cup will crack under the pressure. You aren't usually faced with single, fast-moving attacks that the boss cycles through. Instead, there are multiple obstacles or enemies on the screen at once that are all relatively sluggish but come at you in groups. This is why playing reactively is punishing. Just dealing with things one at a time will cause you to be ill-prepared for something else. This is where that feeling of being trapped often comes from, the feeling that elicits the response, "There's no way I could have possibly dodged that." There's always a lot of things to keep track of at once, and if you don't deal with it proactively, it'll get out of hand. Let's use Captain Brinybeard to highlight this. This is the most obvious fight where failing to keep track of certain obstacles will be the biggest deterrent in you being able to beat the level. During this fight, a barrel will slowly move back and forth around the traversable part of the arena, and if you walk underneath it, it'll drop down and hit you if you don't get out of the way. This barrel isn't hard to dodge when it's actually falling, but having to constantly keep tabs on it spreads your focus thin, and it leads to bouts of panic where you forgot about it for a moment and didn't realize you walked right underneath it. It's also because the barrel is used in tandem with attacks that require you to constantly jump around, forcing you to keep an eye on it since it's inevitably going to drop at some point. It's the same effect as later phases, when the ship starts spitting cannonballs at you, and when you're being pelleted by projectiles, and when the captain starts calling in different minions that you need to listen to sound cues for, and when all of these things happen at once. More attacks that split your focus between different things. And the game teaches you this mindset in the first run and gun stage through a very trial-by-fire method of teaching. Here, you're keeping track of just as much, watching the falling acorns, having to shoot the flowers running at you in different directions, keeping timers on when the blue goose will respawn in relation to when the plants will jump. Look at how both these levels require a lot of micromanagement for their entire duration, this run and gun at the very beginning of the game and this boss in the second last world. Let me be clear and say that this isn't a bad thing. It can be very intense to work around all of these things, and Cuphead does it well because eventually you don't notice that you're multitasking between all this, you just are. It forces you to create a harmony between your brain and your inputs, and once you strike that right flow, it feels very rewarding. But only to a point. Cuphead's biggest flaw is that it goes too far with this concept that eventually it gets tiring. Every boss in this game uses this structure. Some do it more than others, but all of them use it. With Hildeberg, you're watching between the different colored UFOs and keeping that in mind as you dodge the shooting stars. With Werner Werman, you're eyeing which bottle caps are about to pop out of which side while keeping track of which layer Werman is about to shoot his fire. There's always something, whether it's part of the boss itself or part of the arena. This means that the strategy you employ in every level is ultimately the same, even if the things you're actually keeping track of are different. This is a flawed idea because it means that very few levels capitalize on specific parts of your movement and attack abilities. You can use different weapons to spice things up, but at the end of the day, you're just picking whatever can hit the boss most reliably. None of them truly change how you play. I view this less as a slight against the boss design and more to conform around Cuphead's limited moveset. There's only so much you can do with jumps, parries, ducks, and dashes, and since all of the charm upgrades are optional, you can't design bosses around assuming the player has any of them. So why am I complaining then? What else were they supposed to do? Well, first, there are some attacks that do use a reactive approach. The Devil's First phase does it the most, and he's a good boss. His clapping attack is one that uses precise reaction times in a good way. You need to get off the ground right when his arms come out and make use of what little tools you have to stay airborne, either using a dash or unleashing a special to keep airtime until it's safe to land again. There's a branch of split-second decision-making that other bosses lack, and many of his other attacks have this too. I'm not saying that this boss is the golden standard, but my point is that the game didn't have to rely on a proactive playstyle and micromanagement bosses for almost its entire runtime. There are just enough quirks in your kit that more interesting things could have been done but weren't. I see value in some of these mechanics that were just neglected too much. Let's say, for instance, that the charms weren't missable. If they were mandatory rewards, say you get them at the end of the first few levels, then you could vary up the boss design in later worlds because you know the player has acquired all the charms before getting to that area, and you can thus design some attacks around using certain charms. The charms are very simple, so this wouldn't require any more tutorials, but they still do enough to provide for more interesting movement. The smoke bomb alone changes a lot about how you play. Maybe this isn't the perfect solution to this problem, but it would allow for a more unique approach to bosses. You can take a further exploration of Cuphead's moveset rather than making every boss a piece of multitasking mayhem. I think Cuphead hides this general lack of variety in the boss design through the visuals, because even though they're all mechanically similar, they're so drastically different in design and setting that you're too distracted to notice. I know I never did until I came back to play it again for this video. The run-and-guns and airplane levels could be viewed at how the game mixes things up, but that's not always true. These levels are more focused around changing how the player controls rather than to change the way that bosses are designed. The airplane sections take place in a space where you have full control of your horizontal and vertical movement, so this does allow attacks to be more complex than the ground levels since you have more freedom, but they're all still about micromanaging tons of small obstacles. Even then, these levels present their own problems. I generally like their addition, but there's a couple quirks with movement that started to bother me. The biggest one is that you can't control the speed at which you move, it's always the same. Tilting the stick gently in one direction doesn't make you move any slower than if you tilt it all the way. This is at odds with many attacks on expert difficulty that require tight precision and slipping through narrow openings to avoid damage. They also have what is essentially a pseudo-dodge, being able to shrink your plane for much faster movement while restricting your shooting. It does allow for quick adjustments, but it's arguably even harder to be precise in this form since your movement is so much faster. I do think it's a little too fast, but maybe that's just me. Whenever I had to use this form for more than around a second, I felt like I was flying off the rails and losing control. I want to divert from this topic for a bit and talk about the boss arenas themselves and how strong those are with only a few problems. Functionally, I think almost all of them are great. They aren't always you on the left and boss on the right. Sometimes the boss is a background element that you shoot at, and other times it jumps around the level for a more dodge-intensive focus. This provides some variety that the bosses themselves lack, and I appreciate that. In a few fights, the arena is the enemy. Cagney Carnation's last phase completely blocks off the ground level, so you have to maneuver around the 3 platforms to avoid the growing vines and projectiles that he spits out. I like this sort of thing. It forces you to be a little careful with your movement, which, while that is another layer of multitasking, it's one that you have nearly full agency over. Unfortunately, there are some arenas that have too many visual effects that they can block some attacks or projectiles, either that or they have poor color choices. I wouldn't say the majority of them suffer from this, but there are enough that it became noticeable. The most obvious instance of this to me is Rumor Honeybottoms. This is a vertical scrolling stage where you have to keep jumping upwards to avoid the bubbling honey. I think the constant flowing honey animations and clash of colors here is a bit much given how restrictive this arena really is. The boss takes up a good portion of it, and you have to work around whatever platforms are given to you. Sometimes they blend in with the background, and you can't tell where they are just from your peripheral vision. The other scrolling boss, Grim Matchstick, doesn't have this issue simply because the platforms pop out a lot more from the background. There are some other bosses too where I think the clash of colors can make it too hard to actually see some things. I'd say Beppy the Clown, Bon Bon, Dr. Call's Robot, the Devil, and maybe some more that I'm forgetting all do it to some degree. It's all compounded by the smoke effects that come out from so many actions as well. Something dying, you landing on the ground using a special. A lot of these attacks cause a puff of smoke to burst out, and it's subtle but also distracting. And look, none of this criticism is to say that these are bad fights. I wouldn't say there are any bad bosses in Cuphead, but rather they all follow the same design philosophy that wears thin towards the end, and a few of them are too hard on the eyes. There's not much more I can think to say without picking apart all the bosses individually, which I actually did consider doing, but a video on that would be well over an hour, so let's move on. Aside from jumping and dashing, the other defensive tool you have in Cuphead is parrying. This mechanic was used in an odd way. As a reminder, you can hit jump while in the air to parry slap, which nullifies pink attacks, yes, the color pink, while the frames are active. In the ground levels, you'll also bounce off of them like a jump. The fact that parries only block certain attacks makes me think that it was implemented to increase complexity of enemy moves rather than giving you a more intricate moveset. You can only parry when the enemy says so with a pink attack after all. I'm pretty conflicted on this. On one hand, making parries work on more than just pink attacks would open the door for much more complex boss design since you would always have that tool at your disposal. What if it worked on all projectiles, or maybe even anything that could do damage? On the other hand, expanding the usage of parry would do just that, make the game more difficult and less accessible, and I think that was important to the developers. There's no doubt that this game has some mass appeal, the art style is so unique, and keeping a simple moveset draws in casual players while making the bosses mind-numbingly difficult keeps serious players interested. For myself, I think the game would be more interesting if parrying's usage was expanded at least just a bit, and then if some attacks were reworked around that idea, but I don't know for sure. What I can say for sure is that the parry timing is a little weird. It's deceptively easy, the active frames for a parry are longer than they look, and there are a few times where I wait too long to parry because I'm trying to be more precise than I need to. This is more of a nitpick than anything, but I wish the animation was a little clearer on that. It can throw you off when you need to deal with the awkwardness of jumping into parries. The last criticism I have with this is going to sound ridiculous, but it's an issue in multiple fights. Let me also preface this by saying maybe this is just an issue with me. I don't know if this is universal or not, so I won't dwell on it too long. The game doesn't do a good enough job of outlining what can and can't be parried because, and this is true, sometimes it's unclear on what a pink object is. When parries are introduced to you, it's obvious that hot pink objects can always be parried. You parry 3 pink lights to get past the tutorial level, and this is later reinforced in the Mausoleum minigame levels, where you only win by parrying similarly colored ghosts. Eventually though, I discovered some parryable objects by accident that didn't stand out to me as pink, or at least not pink enough. This wouldn't normally be a problem, but knowing about these attacks can make them a hell of a lot easier to dodge, and I felt a little peeved when I discovered these tricks after struggling with some bosses for so long. This big peppermint in Bonbon stage can be parried. When I first saw this, I didn't think it could because it's not entirely pink. It's a pink and white obstacle meant to match the boss design, I thought, so make sure to avoid it. Nope, I was wrong. I discovered this by accident while getting the S rank for this video. I had a point where I accidentally dashed into it and mashed jump out of panic. You can see me immediately turn around because I thought I was going to get hit and wanted to run away if I could. When it parried, I raised an eyebrow and questioned it, so I tested it right after to make sure I was seeing it right. Turns out you can parry this, which I really wish I had known sooner. Same thing with this orb that Honeybottoms can spawn. When I first saw this, I thought it was purple. Now that I know you can parry it, sure, I can kind of see the pink, but I wonder if that's just placebo effect of knowing that it's parryable after the fact. Is it purple or am I wrong? Seriously, you tell me, maybe I need to get my eyes checked. In general, I think all of this could have been communicated better because many of these attacks are designed around being parryable. You have to run into some of them sometimes to avoid damage. This could have been made clearer simply by making the 3 lights in the tutorial different shades of pink. Most objects are hot pink, so that's the example the tutorial gives you, but it wouldn't have hurt to make these lights at least a bit different to show that it's more lenient than you'd probably think. Getting those rules right early on is important for success later, and in my experience the game failed at that a bit. But even so, this was a very fun game to come back to. The intensity of these fights is still just as good as I remember. Cuphead is very good at building tension for a few reasons. First, bosses don't have health bars. They transition between phases, but you'll never have an exact indicator of how close you are, unless you die and the boss laughs at you for how close or far you were. Second is the music. It's an equal partner with the artwork. Every level has a unique theme that suits the boss very well, and every song is a perfect mix of chaos and excitement. The soundtrack is so eccentric and fitting, and it encapsulates the game very well. It's another brilliant piece of artistic talent that went into the game, and I just had to praise it for that really quick. Third, and more importantly, this game is exhausting to play, and I don't mean that in a bad way. The intensity that builds up as you get closer and closer to the end of each level, and the rush of relief that hits you when the announcer screams after you kill a boss, over 3 years later and I still feel it. There's a lot of strong moments like that, and Cuphead did this part very well. I hope to see the DLC address the main issues with bosses that I brought here. I'm hopeful on this. We were teased that the Chalice character has enhanced movement options due to a double jump, and I hope Studio MDHR can take the boss design in more interesting directions thanks to those expanded options. I think it's clear that they aren't shirking on the effort for the DLC at all, which I really respect, and it'll be worth a wait for the art and animation alone. It'll be exciting to revisit our porcelain pals when the time comes, and I hope you've come to appreciate them as much as I have through this video. Thanks for watching.